Let's talk about the legendary event that when Jesus flipped the tables.
So anyone who's listening, whether you're a person who is a Christ follower, Jesus follower, or maybe you're not, some may even think that Jesus didn't even exist. But the reality is, what is outlined in Genesis 1:26 through 30 is really God's ideal state, what God really wants for humanity, right? And what's happened is...
One of the topics you cover is the concept of the dominion in the Bible, and what impact does that have on modern beliefs of animal consumption?
The way that dominion has an impact on our modern understanding.
Is there a spiritual way to kill an animal? Welcome to Nafsika's View, the weekly podcast where we dive into a variety of topics that matter to you. I'm your host, Nafsika, and today we have a thought-provoking guest whose work challenges the intersection of religion, spirituality, and our relationship with animals. Kameron Waters is a former gospel songwriter and musician for Sony and Interscope Records turned filmmaker. When he first realized how people use Christianity to justify animal abuse, he started this journey and eventually co-created Christspiracy. Welcome to the show, Cam.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Looking forward to a really, really interesting conversation today.
Yes, it's going to be very interesting. Your documentary, Christspiracy, was co-directed with Kip Anderson, the producer of What the Health and Cowspiracy, among others. But years ago, before you even had met him, you were at one of Kip's Q&A events and were in the audience and you asked Kip a question. Is there a spiritual way to kill an animal? Tell us a little bit about that moment that sparked the making of this documentary.
Yes. So even backing up before that moment, I was a gospel musician for my career, which was really a build on from my childhood, specifically my teenage years where I really started taking my faith seriously. I grew up in a church environment and family that was really, really devout, Protestant Christian, Southern Baptists, and gospel musicians and singers and ministers and everything themselves. So as an adult in my 20s, I started to really step into that and take it pretty seriously outside of the church, but into an actual career format, making both gospel music and kind of like spiritual, secular, like crossover where there's still kind of a Christian theme, but it's for broader audiences, that type of thing. But I had a number of things that we can get into if we'd like that kind of led me down the road of questioning the consumption of animals, but not so much from a dietary perspective, more from a morality perspective with factory farming and the things that I became aware of through various means that piqued my interest in, hey, what's the best Christian or Christ-like way to approach this issue? Because it's definitely something that's worth considering if you're an animal lover or if you care about God's creatures, that type of thing. So when I fell down that path and really started doing research, it opened up a whole world to me that I never would have imagined was so, so deep. And I do want to say, like, to anyone listening, that we'll get into all of this, but it's really, after all the research and just exploration I've done, I'd say it's one of, if not the most concerning and important issues facing humanity today. And so when I had this deep burning question on my heart and had found some of my own answers to it in various ways, I wanted to go deeper. And I actually found myself in that Q&A with Kip by happenstance. It was kind of a serendipity or a synchronicity, if you will. I was at an event where I was working part-time in between gigs as a musician to make a little extra cash, helping my friend sell some chocolates that she had. She had her own little small business chocolate company. And so she was presenting those at an event in downtown Los Angeles, and I was supporting her. And it just so happened to be that Kip was giving a presentation, a screening of his film, and a Q&A afterwards. And I thought, wow, this is the guy that I need to talk to about this question. Is there a spiritual way to kill an animal? I'll put it this way. How would Jesus kill an animal? And we got into the conversation, and one thing led to the next, to where we ended up talking for about 2 hours, I'd say, at the event. And he looked at his watch and realized he was going to miss his flight if he didn't rush to LAX airport immediately. So I took him in my van that you see in the film that I was living out of at the time.
Okay.
Yeah, I drove him to the airport, and
Oh, wow.
literally as we were pulling up to the drop off for him to fly back to his home, he said, "Hey man, we should really talk about making this a film."
Wow.
And the rest is history.
That's amazing. Oh, that's so fascinating though, how it came to be. I got to say, when I first heard the title being promoted by a vegan community at first, like I got a little worried. I was like, what is this Christspiracy? Are they going to be, what are they going to be talking about? Are they going to try to debunk Christianity? Like, I was so nervous. And then I watched the trailer and I was like, oh, okay, this is kind of cool. And maybe this is about Jesus, the fact that Jesus, I believe, never would kill a living thing. And he's the epitome of compassion after all, right? So, yeah.
The title is definitely a provocative one, and it's for a reason. We want to stop people in their tracks, make them curious. Definitely, it can be challenging for some people. The original title of the film, when we were working with Netflix, which we can get into that whole conversation.
I'd love to get into that next, yes.
Yeah, we were working with Netflix, and based on some, disagreements that we had, we ended up moving in the direction of going down the journey of the research on Jesus, on Christ in this conversation even more, and ended up changing the name to Christspiracy because of that. But just to clarify, when you really look at the word, obviously it's a play on the previous films, Cowspiracy and Seaspiracy, but also, a combination of the word Christ and conspiracy together. But really, the etymology of the words are pretty interesting. Christ being, the anointed one or Messiah, the word that we all know so well. Spiracy is actually rooted in a Latin etymological root, which is spirare, which is where inspiration, respiration comes from. And it just means to breathe. So, really a word that can come across so shocking. Oh, are they trying to debunk something? I was just wanting to point out that the reality, the actual word itself means breath of Christ, or the anointed one for all that breathes. So I think it's a pretty cool title.
Either way, it's a really cool title.
Yeah.
And it took you like 7 years to make this film from what I saw in the movie. And during that time, you and Kip were spied on. You had your homes ransacked. And as you mentioned, a problem with Netflix. Even they asked you to censor some of your findings. That's wild. Like, and proves that there is a true conspiracy at play here. Tell us a little more about that.
Right. So when we started the film, we were under contract with Netflix. Kip, from his previous films at that point, which were Cowspiracy and What the Health, both licensed to Netflix, meaning that he had made the films independently with his co-director Keegan Kuhn, who is also, he's a little more behind the scenes, but they're an incredible duo, those two guys, and they made these amazing films. And when we met and we started talking about this film, which at the time we loosely entitled Cow Spiritual as another play on words for Cowspiracy, but, going into the spiritual side of things, Netflix reached out to him and just said, "Hey, we really love your previous films, how well they've done on our platform, and we'd love to talk about what you're doing." And that led to a conversation where basically they said, "Hey, we'll just sign on your next 2 films and support you, with pre-production and everything." So Christspiracy and Seaspiracy were both signed at the same time. Ali Tabrizi, the director of Seaspiracy, and I were both at about the same place in terms of like filming and preparing and researching this topic. And then we joined forces with Kip. And basically we're creating those in parallel. Seaspiracy was quite a bit further along, so that's why it came out first. And it kept the Netflix original title. They were able to push that one through. However, when we produced our first edit for what was Cowspiritual, but now is entitled Christspiracy, Netflix was pretty uncomfortable. There were a number of things that they just didn't, they loved the topic and they loved the film, and they were just raving about how well they knew it was going to do on their platform. However, they specified that there were just a few things they were uncomfortable with, and not all of it I can get into just for legal reasons, but the short and the sweet is what I can say. the whole issue that we discussed in the film of Jesus, the Nazarene, as opposed to Jesus of Nazareth, and how the latter is a bit of a misnomer to kind of obfuscate who the Nazarenes actually were and what Jesus represented from that standpoint. They didn't really want to go down that road in the film. And also, they were a little uncomfortable that we brought up the Dalai Lama in the film, specifically an article about the Dalai Lama eating lots of animals and everything that but again, we didn't say anything from our lens in regards to that conversation or add on to what the article was already saying. We were just presenting a really major article that someone put out. So we just found it interesting that they didn't want to go those ways. And the more we discussed it, the more we realized they were really looking to make a film that ultimately was more of like a David Attenborough, National Geographic, how all spirituality and religion really just loves and promotes welfare for animals, and maybe a little bit of the conspiracy.
Oh.
But if you've seen our previous films, that's not the way these films roll. And it's really not an accurate depiction of the reality of what's going on. So we just went back and forth. And for me personally, the Jesus, the Nazarene topic, and really going down and focusing the film on the story of Jesus was really important to me. Mm-hmm. And I just knew I couldn't compromise the truth. And so we had a bunch of conversations and decided to part ways. And it was pretty amicable. Mm-hmm. But it wasn't easy. I can tell you that because, they're a big platform. It comes with a lot of benefits to be pushed out with their algorithm on their platform to all of their viewers. However, I will say on the other side of it, I'm so thankful and grateful that it happened the way that it did, because as big as Netflix is, they only have 3% of the world's population, which is significant. But when you really think about it, 3% of the world's population is about the size of Nigeria. If you put all the subscribers into one place, it would be about the population of Nigeria. So there's so many people around the world that can now watch this film without the barrier of having a subscription. We can release all of our additional content because we have hours of footage beyond what we included in the film. We only scratched the surface of the topic in the film itself. So we can release all of our additional footage, and really we can have a call to action at the end of the film. Netflix doesn't allow you to really continue the conversation. It's like you watch this film, your jaw's on the floor. Seaspiracy, for instance, everybody wanted to know more. And by the time the credits roll on Netflix, they're promoting Love Island for you to start watching something else. And you don't really get to sit with it, So we wanted now, and we can do this because we're on our own website, we can follow up with all the viewers and deliver them more interesting content after the fact. So we're really excited about it.
That's great. I agree. You have so much more control this way, and you can reach more people. Do you know how many people you've reached?
To this point, it's the exact number I'd say is a little bit difficult to pinpoint because we've had so many screenings around the world. We released to theaters in March. That was our big release. Before that, we had many, many private screenings, though. It almost got a little bit out of hand because we were just wanting people to see the film and wanting to get feedback because we were releasing independently and we were trying to build the momentum for the release. So there were so many private screenings before the theater release. Then we released to thousands of cinemas worldwide in all the English-speaking nations, and even some non-English speaking like Switzerland and Germany and etc. So we had this worldwide theater release, and then after that we released on our own platform. And since we've released on our platform, we have the ability for people to do private screenings all around the world still, whether they have an organization or a friend group or a church or whatever it is. And it's honestly more than we can even keep up with. So I can tell you that hundreds of thousands of people have seen it at this point for sure.
For sure.
Have we breached the 1 million mark yet? Maybe. I don't know. But that's our goal. Our goal is billions of views.
Yeah, I was just going to say it should be billions. Yeah.
Yeah. So we're pushing as hard and as strong as we can. Definitely the big challenge with stepping away from Netflix is you're stepping out of the marketing juggernaut that is. So we have to do it all ourselves. And really at this point, the marketing team a lot of it's boiled down to me putting out content, editing pieces for the film and, talking head commentary about things that relate to the film. So I'm kind of taking that on almost,
I see your videos. Yeah, they're cool. You're out there, talking to people on the street. I love it.
Yeah, so we're relying on social media and word of mouth and the occasional, PR and podcasts and things like this that we can do. And so it's going to be a slower burn to get to that, millions and millions or billions of views. But in a lot of ways, I think this film is meant to be that way.
Yeah.
I think if billions of people saw this film all at once, because it's so confronting and explosive, for lack of better words, I think that it would be a shock to the system. I think we need this film to trickle out via word of mouth. Yeah, because it allows for someone to tell their friend, hey, I just watched this film. I'm still processing it. It's shifted so much for me. You got to see what it is. And that recommendation coming from a friend allows someone to enter the scenario of watching the film with a little bit more trust. Whereas if they're just watching it on Netflix, people have so many, I guess, concerns about major media these days. And even Netflix has made some really interesting moves with certain pieces of content that they've put out that seem to have quote unquote agendas behind them, pushing certain messages that not everyone agrees with. And so when you release on a platform like that, it raises a lot of questions and concerns for people and doesn't allow them to really experience it, I think, and enter the experience with an open mind. So I'm happy that we're, slowly releasing in a grassroots way. I think it's the way the film was meant to be.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. It was meant to be this way. So yeah, I think you guys made the perfect decision. It's fascinating how you've turned your experiences into in the church into a platform for discussion. In your view, how have religious interpretations historically justified animal consumption?
Well, that's a really deep and long,
It's a deep, yeah.
long explanation. But what I'll say to start, and maybe we'll see how far we go with it.
Yeah.
I would say most of it is rooted in the concept of dominion. I found in my own personal life, in the life of my experience in the church, and now since releasing the film, what I often find myself having conversations with people. And it's this idea, if you aren't familiar, in the opening of the Bible, but in the shared part of the scripture, which not only Christianity uses, but Judaism, which came before it, and Islam, which comes after Christianity, all of these religious paths talk about dominion, because in Genesis, in the creation of the world, the narrative which explains how everything came to be, after humans are created, the first mandate for humanity is what's known as dominion. It's in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, starts in verse 26, where God gives dominion over the birds of the air and the fish of the sea and the beasts of the field and all the wild animals. And then immediately after that, in verse 29, which most people miss, is God prescribes a plant-based diet. He says, herbs of the field and every fruit-bearing seed shall be yours for food. And then in verse 30, even animals are giving plant-based diets. There's an indication of no predation, or that the ideal is no predation. So really, what is outlined in Genesis 1:26 through 30 is really God's ideal state, what God really wants for humanity, right? And what's happened is, because it opens with God gives humanity this dominion, which through tradition and circular reasoning that we can get into, that definition has become domination. It's become rulership, to have authority over, in a way that really a lot of pastors or people unknowingly would translate that as we can kind of do whatever we want with animals and with God's creation. The problem there, to start with, is that root word that they're drawing from, the word dominion comes from the Hebrew yeridu, and the root word is what's really important in Hebrew. And tradition has said that the root word is radah, which does mean rulership, authority, to press down. It's kind of like a king over, like a tyrannical king over their nation or over other nations. But the letters in the word radah don't match the root of the word yeridu. That's the way Hebrew roots work. It's the first three letters of the word tell you what the root of that word is. The true first three letters of the word yeridu is yarad. You can even hear it in the English transliteration. It sounds like a similar word, yeridu and yarad. Well, what does yarad mean? Yarad means to lower oneself in service to. It's like servant leadership, stewardship, etc. And I think that definition most closely aligns with Christian values and with Christ, who, most people I think would agree the story of Jesus is one of a kind of servant leadership, of walking humbly, service to the poor, others, etc. And so the definition itself, I think, is something that has just been obfuscated and mistranslated and misunderstood for so long that it's given people this license to do whatever they want, when in reality, it was the exact opposite. It wasn't that we were authorities over, that we were actually in our humanity, the thing that separates us from the other animals, that we have logic, reason, capacity for empathy, mirror neurons, all of these things, that capacity in humanity was actually meant to inspire us and use this kind of higher intelligence to find ways to better serve animals, make sure they're taken care of. It's the same word in a lot of ways that is used throughout the scripture to talk about how God has dominion over us, or how parents have dominion over their children. It's guiding, it's helping, it's providing for. So that would be, I think, the biggest justification that's built on a mistranslation. And we know too, like I said, Genesis 1:26 through 28 lays out this dominion, and 29, the following verse, is a plant-based diet. So it can't be, that it follows that dominion somehow includes slaughtering and harming animals. So that would be where I would start. And the deeper point that I would make about the consumption of animals aspect is that dominion in scripture, animals aren't food. They're just not food. So it's interesting to me that since releasing the film and since talking about the film, everyone always kind of gets spun out a little bit about the idea that we're even, discussing diet in terms of Christianity, because they feel that this is just like a lower tier issue. It's not something that Jesus was really concerned about. It's not something that the Jewish culture at that time was concerned about, which definitely isn't true for many reasons. But even if we granted that, the deeper point is we're not actually really talking about food, because in Genesis, animals weren't originally food in God's creation. So it's not about diet. It's about ethics. Food is just a consequence of the conversation, because the deeper conversation is, how are we treating animals? How are we really utilizing dominion? And is it matching what God's ideal was? Is it ethical? If we are people who, I think anyone listening is probably against animal abuse. Nobody wants to see animals abused, but there's a disconnect from what I guess constitutes abuse in different contexts. One of them, namely, being industrial agriculture.
Yes, and actually that brings us to the next topic. Let's talk about the legendary event that when Jesus flipped the tables, because there's a lot of different interpretations of that, right? Like you were mentioning in the film, what it actually meant when he flipped the tables and why did he do it?
Right. So, anyone who's listening, whether you're a person who is a Christ follower, Jesus follower, or maybe you're not and your family was, or maybe you're just not at all, you're of a different religion or whatever. Everybody has a different understanding of who Jesus was and is, different perspectives. Some may even think that Jesus didn't even exist, right? But the reality is that scholars all around the world have proven that there was a figure in the Middle East at this time which had a few different key events that absolutely historically happened. And this is atheistic scholars. This is scholars across the board. Just to clarify, I'm not going off this base minimal approach. I think that there's all kinds of reality to the historicity of the person of Yeshua, which we can get into. But I just want to speak to the people that I know may be listening to this who just think Jesus is kind of like a mythological character or invented or whatever. The reality is, just so that we're all on the same page, there are a number of historical facts that scholars agree on. And the central one is that there was an incident in the Temple of Jerusalem and there was a crucifixion. Those two pieces, scholars agree, actually happened. Okay. Now, the temple cleanse is so powerful because, like I said, it is historically agreed upon. It's in all four gospels. There are so many stories of Jesus which don't appear in every gospel. They appear in maybe one or two and not the others, right? But this incident is in all four gospels with illicit detail. And specifically, scholars agree that this incident is what led to his crucifixion. So there's all of this conversation that you may have heard about Jesus's messianic claims, or, claiming to be God, or different ways that he challenged the authority in the system at the time that maybe led to this crucifixion. But the reality is, crucifixion was a Roman punishment. And the Romans only crucified seditionists, people that were enemies of the state, terrorists, if you will, for lack of better words. And this incident, therefore, had to be a substantiation or a basis for the Roman government to finally do the deed of killing Jesus and this movement. It's really the movement they want to kill, because what we see in Mark, the gospel that outlines, it's our earliest gospel. Scholars believe it was written before the other three. And in Mark's gospel, it actually outlines that Jesus and the followers showed up to the temple the day before, almost like they were doing recon to assess the situation. So this was a planned event. And then the temple cleanse happens, and it says that they shut the temple of Jerusalem down for the entire day. The whole day, this place was shut down. So just to frame what the temple really was, we know what it is today. It's where the Dome of the Rock sits. It's the center of, I would say, the majority of conflict on planet Earth. When you really think about it, this one piece of real estate is the most warred over, fought over, talked about piece of real estate on the planet. It's where you've seen the mosque with the golden dome on the top that sits in Jerusalem. So it's a holy site in both Islam, Judaism, and also Christianity. And therefore, when you trace that back to the time of Jesus, what at the time it was called King Herod's temple, or the second temple, and it's the center of all worship for Israel. And there was a holiday that would happen, which still happens today, called Passover, but it happened a bit differently then. During Passover, all of the tribes of Israel would come to the temple and bring animals, or if they weren't able to, they would buy animals from the temple, and they would have this mass animal sacrifice for that Passover week. And the historian Josephus, who again is another one that scholars will use or agree that proves the historicity of Jesus, because Josephus, this, ancient Jewish scholar, asserts that there was a man that lived and, had these particular points. And Josephus declares that during this week of Passover, millions of animals would be slaughtered at the temple for this ritual. So much so that books like the Talmud and other extra Jewish texts will describe that priests were wading up to their ankles or shins in blood. There were so many animals being slaughtered, okay? Now, in our film, you'll see that I do some real recon to confirm this fact, to really understand, is this even possible? Millions of animals? Like, that is literally a slaughterhouse. And we have, from theologians of ancient Christianity to actual the head rabbi of Israel, different voices all confirming that, yes, it's true. The temple at that time was essentially the world's first slaughterhouse. It's the model for how herding cultures turned their animals into a product at kind of mass scale, because without this temple, it's just families maybe eating animals every now and then, but they're mostly, you know, eating grain or what grows of the earth. But during these big festivals, the temple would become a slaughterhouse and it'd be a big feast of everyone consuming animals. And so I went to this temple, and I don't want to give too much away because it's in the film, but in a very for me, it was exciting because it felt like I was living my childhood dreams of Indiana Jones and all of this. But I got to go to the temple and really investigate the drainage systems and everything to understand, is it even possible, or how could a temple like this be a slaughterhouse of that scale? And I just think a lot of Christians don't really understand that fact. They think Jesus and the Bible and this whole idea of animal sacrifice is kind of like, oh, it's just this holy thing and people pray and an animal sacrifice, and then there's all this celebration, and they don't really understand the reality of how gruesome and bloody and everything it was. So bottom line, we're told, I was raised to understand as a Christian, every Easter that comes around, this is the story that's told of when Jesus enters the temple, because it's around the time of where we celebrate Easter. And he flips the tables of the money changers, and he's upset because they've made God's house a marketplace, and they're exchanging money and ripping people off with the really poor exchange rates, etc. But what this film investigates is that this slaughterhouse model may have been more of the object of Jesus's frustration. And if so, how could we prove that? And a lot of it comes down to the language that Jesus actually uses in the condemnation of the temple. He calls it a den of thieves, which indicates and has, I would say, much like the definition of dominion, created a justification or an understanding through circular reasoning that Jesus was upset about the money, because thievery sounds like money, right?
Right.
But there's a deeper translation to that word thieves when you get to the Hebrew.
That's
and
right.
Jesus quoting Jeremiah, that has greater implications for what Jesus was actually frustrated with. And that opens up a whole conversation of, okay, what do we actually know about Jesus that would indicate why he was so upset in the temple? And so we can get into that, but that's really what the film gets into, is his background and the disciples and the movement of the Nazarenes and what they really stood for in regards to animals and animal sacrifice.
Yeah, because I find it really weird that, like, I'm a Christian Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, and every Easter my family and other families will like roast the lamb, on the spit, and I find it weird because the lamb. I'm like, didn't Jesus love the lamb? I don't know. How did that happen? How do we? I mean, I'm sure it's different. I'm not sure if it's other dominations, Christian dominations as well that do that, but how did we come to that?
Yeah, I would say definitely Orthodox and some of the more older traditions hold on to some of that a bit more than, say, what I was raised in, which is Protestantism, the kind of standard Church of America, if you will.
Yeah.
And really, any Christian of any denomination would all agree, basing on just the Orthodox understanding and theology of Christianity, that Jesus ended sacrifice per his sacrifice on the cross, that there's no more animal sacrifice because it's not necessary anymore because of Jesus. And so really the idea of anyone in Christianity keeping the tradition of a Passover lamb on Easter is a little bit strange, just because it's not supposed to occur anymore under just traditional Christian theology. Why certain people do that, I don't know. Maybe it's just holding on to tradition and, trying to live more like they perceive Jesus would have lived in his time, and honoring the Passover and everything. However, the Passover is a holiday. Again, there's so many misunderstandings and mistranslations around Passover. And so first, what I want to say, kind of going off our last question, is a foundational principle to all of this is really understanding who Jesus really was in the context of his time, where the man that lived and walked the earth who he interacted with, who his family was, who his friends and his community were that would have influenced and substantiated some of his claims and what he was doing during his, quote unquote ministry. And I think that's where a lot of people miss things, where I miss things being raised as a Protestant. And I would even say, as someone who, by the way, I think Greek Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox is the Christianity that's the closest to what Jesus actually walked, talked, and preached than any other. I'm actually, in a partnership with a Coptic Orthodox. Oh. And through being with her, I've learned so much about the church, and it's been the perfect thing that I feel God has brought into my life to really understand more about the roots of Christianity. But what I'll say is, even Orthodox tradition, as beautiful as it is foundational, tens to hundreds of years after the death of Jesus. And that first 30 years after Jesus' death, there's a period there where the church is being led by Jesus' blood brother, James the Just, in Jerusalem. And also there is a kind of, Gentile church, if you want to call it that, led by Peter and some of the others in the surrounding areas, Syria, the Decapolis, etc. But it's a Christianity that at the time, even in the book of Acts, is referred to just simply as the way, but they also get referred to as the Nazarenes. The Apostle Paul, when he gets accused of, going around proselytizing and doing what he's doing, the Pharisees ask him, "Are you a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes?" It says that in the scripture, because this was the first Christianity, this Nazarene movement of the way. And the reality is, it's not something that just started with Jesus of Nazareth. The Nazarenes existed before even Jesus. And we have early church fathers which attest to this fact. We also have secular sources like Pliny, who documents the Tetrarchy of the Nazarene, potentially all the way back to the 300s BC. And this is an old ancient sect of Judaism, which was outside of the typical Pharisee, Sadducee, Orthodox Judaism. And that's why you see Jesus in the scripture. He's always kind of questioning and probing at the Pharisees and the Sadducees, because he himself came from a different sect. And this is going to sound like really, maybe out there information to a lot of people who are from the church. You haven't heard this type of thing. But I would just encourage everyone, before we even go any further, anything I say, don't take my word for it at all. I'm just presenting information. Go research it for yourself and fall down the rabbit hole if you really want to. And if you really, for me, it was always about getting closest that I can to the original Jesus and what he really taught, preached, and led. And so to wrap all that up, I'm just wanting to really frame this incident in the temple and these groups by understanding that the early church fathers wrote about the Nazarenes, the ones that existed even before Jesus, as just like the other Jewish sects in every way, except for one key difference. And it was that they rejected animal sacrifice and even consumption of flesh as unlawful. And they believed that these practices were not God's original intention, that humanity had fallen into this practice through learning from Babylonian or maybe Egyptian practices and other things when they were enslaved, but it wasn't an actual practice of the original Hebrew way. And so they were trying to restore, they are a restoration movement to that original dominion that we talked about, which didn't involve slaughter of animals, but as Jesus kind of said metaphorically, but maybe it was a bit more literal, it was showing dominion through the kind of idea of the good shepherd that we know of Jesus. John 10:11, I am the good shepherd, and the good shepherd lays his life down for the sheep. This is a metaphor of that servant leadership, that the one who shepherds the flock actually sacrifices himself in his own life to try to bring about the best order of creation. So that's who these Nazarenes were. And the final piece, this is the piece that I think made Netflix uncomfortable, is the reason why we don't know about this, and the reason why we aren't taught about this, and why it's not common knowledge. It's no one's fault by any means. It's because there has been this misnomer for the last 2,000 years around the title of Jesus of Nazareth. It's probably one of the most common titles of Jesus other than Jesus Christ. Most people know, oh, Jesus of Nazareth, yeah. But there's a problem, which we explore in the film, in that there is no record of a city named Nazareth until 200 years after Jesus' death in Christian sources. And in secular sources, it's not until 400 years after Jesus' death. So when you really get into it, the reality is you go back to that Pliny source that I mentioned earlier, and there's some other texts that attest to this. There was much more likely a region of Nazara, which is west of Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, and what's known as the Transjordan, the other side of the Jordan, where these groups lived and they protected and honored a more ancient version of the way of Judaism. And Jesus most likely arose through his family out of that tradition and then came to Judea to try to reform and wake everyone up after his baptism to this reality that, hey, God never wanted this. And his mission was to preach many things, not just about animals. Obviously, it's about people doing unto others as you'd have them do unto you, about loving God, all of the beautiful teachings. But he was making a beeline for the temple and for Jerusalem. And that's where he knew and where his ministry ultimately concluded to say, hey, we're really corrupting our faith through this practice and all this bloodshed and everything that's going on. So I'll end there and we can keep going on more of this subject.
That's interesting. Yeah. There's a lot to unpack there.
Crucifixion was a Roman punishment, and the Romans only crucified seditionists, people that were enemies of the state. The Bible and these scriptures, if I really believe them to hold truth, I gotta study them critically and honestly and be willing to really confront myself with whatever I may find, because watch the film so that you can learn or understand what the word thieves really means in the Hebrew, which is behind it, because Jesus would have been speaking Hebrew, quoting the prophet Jeremiah right there, and it's way more condemning. But